The great inflation of the 1970s.
Definitely a turbulent time for sure.
You know, that time when prices seemed to just skyrocket overnight and nobody could quite figure out how to get a handle on it.
And you know what's really interesting is that while it might seem like ancient history,
Right.
the lessons from that era are surprisingly relevant what we see happening in the economy today.
Okay, so let's kind of set the stage here.
Okay.
You know, the 1970s was a time of major change.
Yeah.
Social upheaval, political scandals, and then on top of it all, this economic roller coaster. So what really kicked off this inflationary spiral?
Well, you can't really just point to one single culprit.
Right.
It was really kind of a perfect storm of different factors all kind of colliding at the same time.
Yeah.
But one fundamental issue was that there was simply too much money circulating in the economy.
So too much money chasing the same amount of stuff. How did we end up with all this extra cash in the first place?
Well, that's where the Federal Reserve comes in. You know, their job is to keep the economy humming along smoothly.
Right.
And back then, they were operating under this theory that they could boost employment by accepting a little bit of inflation.
Okay.
The idea was that a little inflation would encourage businesses to invest and hire more people. It turns out that the relationship between inflation and unemployment, which economists called the Phillips curve, wasn't as straightforward as they thought. What happened in the 1970s actually blew a hole in that theory because we ended up with both high inflation and high unemployment.
Oh, wow.
A real economic head-scratcher that we call stagflation.
Ouch, that's a double whammy.
It is.
So the Fed's strategy backfired. But what else was going on that added fuel to the fire?
The U.S. was heavily involved in the Vietnam War at the time, which was a huge drain on government spending.
For sure.
On top of that, you had these ambitious social programs being rolled out.
Yeah.
All of this created these budget deficits,
Right.
meaning that the government was spending more than it was taking in.
Right, so basically the government was writing checks it couldn't quite cash.
Yeah.
And how did that contribute to inflation?
Well, think of it like this.
Okay.
When the government runs a deficit,
Uh-huh.
it has to borrow money to cover the difference. And that borrowing increases the overall money supply,
Uh-huh.
which, as we talked about earlier, can lead to inflation.
Okay. I'm starting to see how all these pieces kind of fit together.
Yeah.
We've got the Fed pumping money into the economy,
Right.
the government spending beyond its means, and this Phillips curve idea falling apart. There was something about the gold standard.
You're right. Up until 1971, the U.S. dollar was tied to the price of gold.
Okay.
It was part of a system designed to stabilize global currencies after World War II.
Right.
But as the U.S. economy grew and more dollars were circulating globally,
Yeah.
it became harder and harder to maintain that fixed link to gold.
It's like trying to hold a balloon underwater.
Yeah,
Eventually something's got to give.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that something was the gold standard.
Okay.
President Nixon decided to sever the tie between the dollar and gold,
Wow.
which made the dollar a free-floating currency.
Okay, so the dollar was cut loose.
Yes.
And now it was up to the markets to determine its value. How did that impact inflation?
Well, it added another layer of complexity.
Right.
Some argue that removing that constraint of the gold standard allowed for more flexibility in managing the money supply,
Okay.
but it also introduced more uncertainty and volatility into the system.
Right, so it's kind of a mixed bag.
Yeah.
More flexibility, but also more potential for things to go haywire.
And then you have the energy crisis of the 1970s, the oil embargo.
Oh, absolutely. Those long lines at the gas station and the feeling that like the world was running out of fuel, that was a crazy time.
Well, those energy shocks weren't just an inconvenience. They were
Yeah.
a major driver of inflation. When the price of oil goes up, the cost of producing and transporting practically everything goes up too.
So we're talking about a classic supply side shock
Yes.
hitting the economy.
Uh-huh.
But there's another piece of the puzzle that you had mentioned, bad data.
Yeah.
What was going on there?
Well, it turns out policymakers were working with some faulty information. They were overestimating the economy's potential output and underestimating the true unemployment rate.
Wow.
Basically, they thought the economy was in better shape than it actually was.
So they were driving the car with a broken speedometer?
Yeah, pretty much.
No wonder they had trouble staying on the road.
Exactly, and that's a crucial point because they were operating with inaccurate data.
Right.
They made decisions that actually made the inflation problem worse.
It's a sobering reminder that even the best intentions can go astray if you're not working with the right information.
Absolutely, and that's why having accurate data and a clear understanding of the economic forces at play is so crucial for making sound policy choices.
Yeah, I totally agree. So we've got this perfect storm brewing loose, monetary policy government, overspending the gold standard, going bust energy shocks, and to top it all off, faulty data guiding the decision makers. It's no wonder things got out of hand.
It was a mess. There's no other way to put it. And by the late 1970s, it was clear that something drastic had to be done. I mean, inflation was in the double digits. People were losing faith in the economy, and the traditional tools just weren't working.
Okay, this is where I imagine things took a pretty dramatic turn.
Right.
So who stepped up to wrestle this inflation monster into submission?
That would be Paul Volcker.
He became chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1979 and was absolutely determined to break the back of inflation, even if it meant some short-term pain for the economy.
This is where it gets really interesting. What did Volcker do differently?
Volcker basically ripped up the old playbook. He knew that controlling inflation would require this fundamental shift in the Fed's approach. Instead of trying to fine-tune the economy and keep unemployment low, he made fighting inflation the top priority.
So he put on the brakes hard.
You could say that he slammed on the brakes, actually.
Yeah.
Volcker drastically raised interest rates, making it much more expensive for businesses and consumers to borrow money.
Right.
This slowed down economic activity,
Yeah.
which led to a recession and a spike in unemployment.
Ouch. That sounds pretty painful. Was it really necessary to go that far?
Well, Volcker believed that the pain of a recession was the lesser of two evils.
He argued that allowing inflation to spiral out of control would ultimately be far more damaging to the economy
Right.
and to people's lives in the long run.
I'm starting to see why he's considered such a pivotal figure in economic history.
Yeah.
He was willing to make these really tough choices,
Right.
even unpopular ones, to really try to get inflation under control.
Exactly. Volcker knew that restoring confidence in the economy
Right.
required demonstrating that the Fed was serious about fighting inflation, even if it meant causing some short-term discomfort.
Yeah.
And you know what? His strategy worked.
So after all this turmoil, did Volcker's shock therapy actually inflation down?
It did. It took a few years,
Okay.
and there was definitely some pain along the way.
Right.
But by the mid-1980s, inflation was back under control.
Wow.
The U.S. economy began to recover, and the lessons learned from the Great Inflation had a profound impact on economic policymaking for decades to come.
It's fascinating how one person's actions can have such a ripple effect. Volcker's legacy is definitely one for the history books.
No doubt about it, he's considered a hero by many economists for his unwavering commitment to price stability. But it's important to remember that his policies also had some lasting consequences.
Like what? What were some of the unintended side effects of this aggressive approach?
Well, remember those sky-high interest rates? They had a devastating impact on certain industries, like manufacturing and agriculture. Many businesses went bankrupt.
Right.
And unemployment remained high for a while, even after inflation started to come down.
So it wasn't a painless victory. There were some real casualties along the way.
That's right. And those high interest rates also attracted foreign investment,
Okay.
which pushed up the value of the dollar,
Right.
making American exports more expensive
Right.
and imports cheaper. This contributed to a growing trade deficit, which became a major economic issue in the following years.
It seems like there's always a trade-off, isn't there? You solve one problem and another one pops up.
That's the nature of economics, really.
Right.
It's a complex system with interconnected parts, and any action, no matter how well-intentioned, can have unintended consequences.
So we've tackled the causes of the Great Inflation, the dramatic measures taken, the lasting consequences. But I'm curious, what can we learn from this wild ride?
Yeah.
Why should people today care about what happened back then?
That's a great question, and I think there are several important takeaways from the Great Inflation that are relevant to us today. First, it shows us the dangers of letting inflation get out of control.
Once that inflationary genie is out of the bottle, it's incredibly hard to put it back in.
Exactly. And secondly, it highlights the importance, the need for a central bank that's willing to make tough decisions to maintain price stability.
So having someone like Volcker at the helm, someone who's not afraid to go against the grain, is crucial.
Thirdly, the Great Inflation teaches us that Economic policies, no matter how well-intentioned, can have unintended consequences.
It's like that butterfly effect.
Yeah,
A small change in one place can have ripple effects throughout the entire system.
precisely. And that's why it's so important to carefully consider the potential consequences of our actions, both at the individual level and at the policy level.
I think that's a valuable lesson for all of us. But let's shift gears a bit. We've focused on the economic side of things.
Okay.
But the Great Inflation wasn't just about numbers on a chart, right?
Right?
It had a real impact on people's lives.
Absolutely. It eroded people's purchasing power, making it harder to afford basic necessities.
Right.
It created uncertainty and anxiety as people worried about their jobs, their savings, their future. And it fueled social and political divisions as people blamed different groups for the economic turmoil.
So it wasn't just an economic crisis, it was a social and political crisis as well.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how these different aspects of our lives are all interconnected.
They are, and the Great Inflation is a stark reminder that economic events don't happen in a vacuum.
Right.
They have a ripple effect that touches every aspect of our lives.
You know, thinking about the impact on people's everyday lives, it makes me wonder how they coped. Did they change their spending habits? Did they invest differently?
People definitely adapted their behavior. They started looking for ways to stretch their budgets.
Right.
Less shopping at discount stores, maybe putting off major purchases. They also looked for ways to protect their savings from inflation.
So people became more resourceful, more frugal, maybe even a little bit more skeptical of traditional financial advice.
Exactly, and the experience of living through that period probably shaped their attitudes towards money and investing for years to come.
I bet it did. It's like going through a financial boot camp. You come out the other side with a whole new perspective on money and its value.
That's a great analogy, and I think it highlights an important point. The Great Inflation wasn't just some abstract historical event.
Right.
It was a lived experience that shaped the way an entire generation about money risk and the future.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about dates and facts. It's about the stories of real people who lived through those events and how those experiences shaped their lives and the world around them.
Well said, and the story of the Great Inflation is one that continues to resonate today.
It really is fascinating how something that happened decades ago can still feel so relevant today as we're talking about this. I can't help but think about all the economic headlines we see, rising prices, supply chain issues, and of course this ever-present debate about inflation. Does any of this sound familiar?
Absolutely, and while history doesn't repeat itself exactly, it often rhymes. The Great Inflation offers some valuable cautionary tales about the dangers of ignoring the warning signs and failing to address those underlying economic imbalances.
Okay, so knowing what we know now about the Great Inflation, what should we be keeping an eye on today? What are some of those potential red flags?
Well, one key area to watch is government spending. Just like in the 1970s, large budget deficits and excessive government borrowing can fuel inflation. It's not always a bad thing. Sometimes it's necessary to stimulate the economy,
Right.
but it's something to monitor closely.
So keeping an eye on the national debt clock isn't a bad idea.
Another thing to watch is the money supply. If the Federal Reserve keeps pumping money into the economy without a corresponding increase in goods and services, it can create an imbalance that leads to inflation.
Right, too much money chasing too few goods. That's the classic recipe for rising prices. What about those external shocks like the energy crisis of the 1970s? Could something like that happen again?
Absolutely. Global events like wars, natural disasters, or political instability can disrupt supply chains and send prices soaring. Think about the recent pandemic and its impact on everything from microchips to lumber.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we live in this complex and interconnected world, and events on the other side of the globe can have a real impact on our own economy.
Exactly. And it underscores the importance of building resilience into our system, diversifying our supply chains, and just being prepared for the unexpected.
So we've got government spending, money supply, global shocks to watch out for. Is there anything else we should be paying attention to?
Well, it's also important to remember that inflation isn't always driven by just one factor. It's often a combination of things interacting in these really complex ways. And sometimes it can be difficult to pinpoint the exact cause.
This is like a detective novel where you have to gather all the clues and piece them together to solve the mystery.
Exactly. And sometimes there's no single smoking gun.
Right.
It's about understanding the underlying economic dynamics and how all these different factors can interact to create those inflationary pressures.
It sounds like understanding inflation requires a bit of economic detective work. But beyond keeping a watchful eye on these factors, Are there any lessons from the Great Inflation that we can apply today to prevent it from happening again?
Absolutely. One key lesson is the importance of clear and consistent communication from policymakers.
Okay.
When people understand what's happening in the economy and what actions are being taken, they're more likely to have confidence in the system.
So transparency is key. No more smoke and mirrors.
Exactly. And it's not just about communicating clearly, it's also about acting decisively.
Yeah.
The Great Inflation showed us the dangers of delaying those tough decisions. Sometimes you have to take short-term pain to avoid long-term economic damage.
Kind of like ripping off a bandage. It might sting for a moment, but it's better than letting the wound fester.
Precisely. And lastly, I think the Great Inflation teaches us the importance of humility. Models and theories are useful, but they're not perfect.
Right.
We need to be open to new information, willing to adjust our course, and always learning from our mistakes.
It's been a fascinating journey back in time, and I think we've uncovered some valuable insights that can help us navigate the economic challenges of our own time. Thank you for joining us on this adventure, and remember, risk happens fast, think different. Until next time.